Hello. Make yourself comfortable, and let me take you on a journey through the lives of the most important princes, regents, and rulers of Kyivan Rus, their biographies, their achievements, their struggles, and the continuous evolution of a state shaped by the leaders who defined its destiny. But before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support its growth. Long before Kyivan Rus emerged as one of the most influential states of medieval Europe, the lands surrounding the middle course of the Dnipro River were already home to human communities with deep historical roots. Archaeological discoveries indicate that these territories had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. Settlements, burial sites, tools, ceramics, and traces of early agriculture reveal the presence of organized societies long before the first written references to the city of Kyiv. The geographical position of the region played a decisive role in its early development. Located on high hills overlooking the Dnipro River, the future site of Kyiv occupied one of the most strategically valuable locations in Eastern Europe. The river served not only as a source of water and food but also as a natural transportation corridor connecting northern forests, southern steppes, and the Black Sea basin. Over time, this location became a meeting point for merchants, travelers, warriors, and migrating peoples. The earliest written references to the region appear in ancient Greek, Roman, and Byzantine sources. Classical authors described the lands north of the Black Sea as inhabited by various tribal groups, including Scythians, Sarmatians, and later Slavic populations. Although these sources do not mention Kyiv by name, they confirm that the region played an important role in the political and economic geography of the ancient world. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Slavic communities had become increasingly visible in archaeological and written evidence. These early Slavic groups developed agricultural settlements, practiced animal husbandry, and established local trade networks. Over time, tribal unions began to form across the forests and river valleys of Eastern Europe. Among these groups were the Polans, a tribal union that occupied the lands along the middle Dnipro. According to later historical tradition, the Polans would become closely associated with the rise of Kyiv. Their settlements were located in an area that offered both natural protection and access to important trade routes. The most famous account of Kyiv's origins appears in the Primary Chronicle, compiled in the early 12th century. According to this source, the city was founded by three brothers, Chi, Shek, and Korev, and their sister Libid. The chronicle states that each brother settled on one of the surrounding hills, and the settlement founded by Chi eventually became known as Kyiv. Modern historians view this story as a mixture of legend and historical memory. While the exact identities of these figures cannot be confirmed with certainty, archaeological evidence supports the existence of fortified settlements in the Kyiv region dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries. This suggests that the legend may preserve memories of real processes of settlement and early political organization. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the region around Kyiv had become increasingly important. Trade connections expanded, craft production developed, and local elites began to emerge. Fortified settlements on the Dnipro hills indicate growing concerns for defense, organization, and control of movement along the river. During the 8th and 9th centuries, larger geopolitical changes began to affect the region. Trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea with the Byzantine Empire became increasingly active. This route, later known as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, transformed the Dnipro corridor into one of the most valuable economic arteries of medieval Europe. Scandinavian merchants and warriors, known in Eastern Europe as Varangians, began traveling along these waterways. Their arrival did not replace local populations or institutions. Instead, they entered an already active political and economic environment shaped by Slavic tribes, steppe contacts, and regional trade. At the same time, powerful neighboring states influenced the development of the region. The Khazar Khaganate controlled parts of the steppe and trade networks to the southeast, while Byzantine political and economic influence reached northward through the Black Sea. The lands around Kyiv existed within this complex network of competing powers, alliances, and commercial interests. By the middle of the 9th century, the foundations of a larger political transformation had already been established. Tribal unions were becoming more centralized, trade networks were expanding, and military leaders were beginning to consolidate authority over wider territories. Out of this environment, shaped by geography, commerce, migration, diplomacy, and conflict, emerged the political world that would soon be associated with one of the most enduring dynasties in Eastern European history, the Rurikids. Among the earliest figures associated with the formation of the ruling dynasty of Rus, none has generated more historical debate than Rurik. His name stands at the beginning of the dynasty later known as the Rurikids, a line of rulers that would shape the political development of the lands centered around Kyiv for centuries. Yet the historical identity of Rurik remains one of the most debated questions in early medieval Eastern European history. The earliest written account of Rurik appears in the primary chronicle, compiled in Kyiv in the early 12th century. Like many medieval chronicles, this source combines historical memory, political tradition, and literary interpretation. According to the chronicle, Rurik was a Varangian leader invited by local tribal elites during the second half of the 9th century to participate in the establishment of political order and dynastic rule. Modern historians approach this narrative with caution. No contemporary document from the 9th century directly confirms the life of Rurik, and many details of his biography remain uncertain. However, the consistent appearance of his name in later dynastic traditions suggests that the memory of an early founding figure was deeply rooted in the political culture of Rus. Archaeological evidence from the Middle Dnipro region demonstrates that by the 8th and 9th centuries the lands surrounding present-day Kyiv already contained fortified settlements, developed craft production, agricultural communities, and active trade networks. These findings confirm that the political and economic foundations of Rus were already emerging in the south long before later northern political centers became historically significant. The region of Kyiv occupied a uniquely strategic position. Located on the high banks of the Dnipro River, it controlled one of the most important transportation corridors of medieval Europe. Through this river system, merchants, diplomats, warriors, and travelers moved between the Baltic Basin, the Black Sea, and the Byzantine world. By the middle of the 9th century, local tribal unions such as the Polans had already developed increasingly complex political structures. fortified settlements, burial complexes, imported goods, Byzantine coins, weapons, and luxury items discovered by archaeologists point to the existence of local elites capable of organizing trade, defense, and political authority. Within this environment, the arrival of Scandinavian military and commercial groups, known in historical sources as Varangians, did not create civilization where none existed. Instead, these groups entered an already active political landscape and became participants in existing systems of trade, warfare, diplomacy, and dynastic formation. The name Rus itself remains a subject of scholarly discussion. Some linguists connect the term to Scandinavian origins, while others emphasize the possibility of local adaptation within the Dnipro region. Regardless of its linguistic roots, by the late 9th century the term Rus had become associated with a ruling military elite connected to the political center forming around Kyiv. According to later dynastic tradition, Rurik became the founder of this ruling house. While the precise geographic details of his early activity remain uncertain, his historical significance lies not in the exact location of his first residence, but in the emergence of a dynastic line that would soon establish lasting authority over the lands of Rus. Equally important is the fact that early written sources do not describe Rurik as the founder of Kyiv itself. By the time his name appears in dynastic tradition, Kyiv already existed as an established settlement, a fortified center, and an important node of regional trade. The significance of Rurik therefore lies not in the creation of the city, but in the formation of a political dynasty that would eventually connect military leadership, dynastic succession, and territorial consolidation under a single ruling house. According to the primary chronicle, before his death in approximately 879, Rurik entrusted the future of his young son Iar to one of his closest military companions, a leader named Oleg. Within only a few years, Oleg would move south toward the Dnipro lands and transform Kyiv from a powerful regional center into the political heart of a rising medieval state. Among the early rulers of the Rurik dynasty, few figures left a stronger mark on the formation of Kyivan statehood than Oleg, later remembered in historical tradition as Oleg the Prophet. His reign marks one of the most decisive turning points in the early history of Rus, the moment when separate centers of political influence were brought together under a single ruling authority, and Kyiv emerged as the undisputed heart of a rising medieval state. The earliest written information about Oleg comes from the primary chronicle, compiled in Kyiv in the early 12th century. According to this source, before his death, Rurik entrusted his young son Iar and the future of his dynasty to Oleg, one of his most trusted military companions. Whether Oleg was a relative, a military commander, or a political ally remains uncertain, but later tradition consistently presents him as the guardian of dynastic continuity. By the late 9th century, the lands of Eastern Europe were undergoing profound transformation. Trade routes connecting the Baltic Basin with the Black Sea had become increasingly active. Slavic tribal unions, local military elites, merchants, and foreign warrior groups competed for influence over river crossings, fortified settlements, and commercial centers. Unlike later rulers who inherited established institutions, Oleg entered a political landscape that was still fluid and contested. Authority depended not only on military strength, but also on the ability to secure alliances, control trade, and integrate local elites into a broader political structure. According to the primary chronicle, around the year 882, Oleg began a major campaign toward the lands of the Middle Dnipro. His objective was not simply military expansion, but political consolidation. By controlling the river corridor, he could unite economically vital territories under one authority. At this time, Kyiv was already an established urban and fortified center with deep regional roots. Archaeological evidence confirms continuous settlement, craft production, trade activity, and defensive construction in the Kyiv Hills long before Oleg's arrival. The city was strategically positioned on one of the most important commercial arteries in medieval Europe. The chronicle states that Kyiv at that time was governed by Askold and Dir, rulers whose exact origins remain debated among historians. Some scholars associate them with earlier military elites connected to regional trade networks, while others view them as members of broader Scandinavian political circles operating in Eastern Europe. According to the traditional narrative, Oleg approached Kyiv using both military planning and political deception. After gaining access to the city, Askold and Dir were removed from power, and Oleg established his authority over the settlement. Whether every detail of this account is historically exact remains uncertain. Medieval chronicles often combine historical memory with literary structure. However, the broader process described by the source, political consolidation centered on Kyiv during the late 9th century, is strongly supported by archaeological and historical evidence. After securing control of the city, Oleg reportedly declared Kyiv to be the mother of the cities of Rus. Regardless of the precise wording, this phrase reflects a major historical reality. From this period onward, Kyiv became the principal political, economic, and symbolic center of the emerging state. Oleg's rule was not limited to Kyiv itself. Over the following years, he expanded political influence over neighboring tribal territories, established tribute systems, strengthened military organization, and secured control over major segments of the Dnipro trade corridor. One of his greatest achievements was the integration of local Slavic elites with the military leadership of the ruling dynasty. Rather than replacing existing structures, Oleg appears to have built alliances that allowed different regional communities to function within a larger political framework. Foreign policy also played a central role in his reign. The growing power of Rus inevitably brought it into contact with the Byzantine Empire, the most powerful political and economic force in the region. According to written sources, in 907 Oleg launched a major campaign toward Constantinople. While some details of the campaign remain debated, subsequent treaties between Rus and Byzantium in the early 10th century confirm that the rulers of Kyiv had achieved diplomatic recognition and secured favorable trade privileges. These agreements granted merchants from Rus legal protections, access to Byzantine markets, and formal diplomatic status. Such achievements demonstrate that by the early 10th century, the political entity centered in Kyiv had become a recognized participant in international affairs. Oleg's reign, traditionally ending around 912, laid the political foundations for everything that followed. He did not found Kyiv, nor did he create civilization from empty lands. Instead, he united existing political, economic, and military forces under a dynastic authority centered in the ancient city on the Dnipro. By the time of his death, the foundations of Kyivan Rus had been firmly established. After the death of Oleg, the leadership of the growing state centered in Kiev passed to Iyer, the son of Rurik and the next ruler of the emerging dynasty. By the time Iyer assumed power in the early 10th century, the foundations of Kyivan rule had already been established. Kiev controlled important sections of the Dnipro trade corridor, tribute relationships had been formed with neighboring tribal unions, and diplomatic contacts with the Byzantine Empire had already begun. Yet the political system remained fragile, and maintaining authority required constant military, economic, and diplomatic effort. The earliest written information about Iyer comes primarily from the primary chronicle. As with many rulers of this era, separating precise historical fact from later literary tradition is not always possible. However, both written and archaeological evidence confirm that the first half of the 10th century was a period of territorial consolidation, expanding trade, and increasingly complex political organization centered around Kiev. Unlike Oleg, whose legacy was closely tied to political unification, Iyer's reign appears to have focused on preserving and strengthening what had already been created. His authority depended on maintaining the loyalty of regional elites, securing trade routes, collecting tribute, and demonstrating military strength when local resistance emerged. One of the central institutions of early Kyivan rule was the tribute system. Local communities and tribal unions under the authority of Kiev were expected to provide goods, silver, livestock, or agricultural products to the ruling elite. This tribute supported military forces, diplomatic activity, and the administration of expanding territories. The process of collecting tribute was known as the annual circuit, during which the prince and his armed retinue traveled through subordinate lands to gather resources and reaffirm political loyalty. This system provided economic stability, but it also created tension between the ruling center and local populations. During Iyer's reign, several neighboring groups challenged Kyivan authority. Historical sources describe campaigns aimed at preserving influence over eastern and southern territories, where local leaders occasionally resisted tribute demands or sought greater independence. At the same time, Kiev's commercial ambitions continued to expand. Trade with Byzantium remained a major source of wealth and political prestige. Control of river routes connecting the forests of the north, the agricultural lands of the Middle Dnipro, and the Black Sea markets was essential to the prosperity of the state. In 941, Iyer launched a major military campaign against the Byzantine Empire. The exact causes remain debated, but economic interests, diplomatic disputes, and competition over trade privileges likely played important roles. According to Byzantine and East Slavic sources, the campaign ended in failure. The Byzantine navy used a weapon known as Greek fire, a highly effective incendiary substance capable of burning even on water. Iyer's fleet suffered heavy losses, and the campaign failed to secure its objectives. Despite this setback, Iyer did not abandon his foreign ambitions. In 944, he organized another campaign toward Byzantine territories. This time, large-scale combat appears to have been avoided, and negotiations led to a new treaty between Kiev and Constantinople. Although the treaty provided continued access to trade, some of the privileges previously obtained under Oleg appear to have been reduced. Even so, the agreement confirmed that the rulers of Kyiv remained recognized participants in regional diplomacy. While foreign policy brought both success and setbacks, it was internal politics that would ultimately define the end of Ayar's reign. According to the primary chronicle, in 945 Ayar traveled to the lands of the Derevlian tribal union to collect tribute. After receiving payment, he reportedly decided to return and demand additional tribute, likely seeking greater revenue for his military retinue. This decision provoked fierce resistance. The Derevlians, already burdened by tribute obligations, viewed the additional demand as an abuse of princely authority. The chronicle describes Ayar's death as exceptionally brutal. He was captured by the Derevlians and executed in a manner intended to serve as both punishment and political warning. Although the precise details may contain literary exaggeration, there is little doubt that his death resulted from a violent uprising against excessive tribute demands. Ayar's death exposed one of the greatest weaknesses of the early Kyivan political system. Authority based solely on military power and tribute could generate wealth, but without administrative reform, it also created instability. Yet Ayar's death did not lead to the collapse of the dynasty. Instead, it opened the way for one of the most remarkable rulers in the history of Kyivan Rus, his widow, Olga. Few rulers in the history of Kyivan Rus left a legacy as complex, powerful, and enduring as Princess Olga. Remembered both as a ruthless political strategist and as one of the earliest Christian rulers connected to the dynasty of Kyiv, Olga stands at the intersection of two historical eras. Her life reflects the transition from the harsh realities of early tribal politics to the emergence of more structured systems of governance, diplomacy, and cultural transformation. Olga entered historical records during one of the most unstable moments in the early history of Kyivan Rus. In 945, her husband, Prince Ayar, was killed during a violent uprising by the Derevlians after a conflict over tribute collection. His death created an immediate political crisis. Their son, Sviatoslav, was still a child, and the future of the ruling dynasty was suddenly uncertain. At this critical moment, Olga assumed power as regent on behalf of her young son. In a political environment dominated by military elites and dynastic rivalries, her ability to secure control over Kyiv and preserve the authority of the ruling house was extraordinary. The primary chronicle presents Olga's first actions as a series of carefully planned acts of political revenge against the Derevlians. According to the chronicle, after Ayar's death, the Derevlians sent envoys to Kyiv proposing that Olga marry their ruler and unite both political centers under their authority. Instead of accepting their proposal, Olga reportedly responded with calculated deception. The chronicle describes how the first delegation was buried alive after being welcomed with ceremonial honors. A second delegation was later burned inside a bathhouse. Although medieval chroniclers often used dramatic literary imagery, most historians agree that these stories reflect a real campaign of political punishment designed to eliminate opposition and restore dynastic authority. The final stage of Olga's campaign culminated in a military expedition against the Derevlian center of Iskorostan. According to the chronicle, after a prolonged siege, Olga captured the city and imposed devastating punishment on its leadership. While some details remain difficult to verify, archaeological and historical evidence supports the conclusion that a major political suppression took place. Olga's revenge secured her immediate authority, but her true historical significance lies not only in military action. Once her position was firmly established, she initiated some of the earliest known administrative reforms in the history of Kyivan Rus. Recognizing the dangers of an unstable tribute system, the same system that had led to Ir's death, Olga introduced a more organized structure for tax collection and regional administration. She established fixed tribute obligations, designated collection centers, and clearer territorial responsibilities for local officials. These reforms reduced the need for constant military tribute expeditions and created a more predictable relationship between the ruling center and Kyiv and subordinate territories. Many historians consider Olga's policies among the earliest examples of institutional state development in Eastern Europe. Olga also demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill. During the middle of the 10th century, she established direct political contact with the Byzantine Empire, the most powerful state in the region. Around the year 957, Olga traveled to Constantinople, where she was formally received by Emperor Constantine VII. Byzantine records confirm her visit and describe her as a ruler of significant political importance. During this visit, Olga accepted Christianity, becoming one of the earliest known members of the Kyivan ruling dynasty to embrace the new faith. The exact circumstances of her baptism remain debated, but its political significance is undeniable. By accepting Christianity, Olga established cultural and diplomatic bridges between Kyiv and the Christian world. Although the wider population of Rus remained largely pagan during her lifetime, her conversion marked the beginning of a transformation that would later reshape the entire civilization. Olga also sought to promote Christianity within her own lands. Historical evidence suggests that she supported the construction of early churches, encouraged religious contacts with Constantinople, and attempted to influence the education of her son. However, her son Sviatoslav remained committed to traditional warrior values and did not convert during her lifetime. As a result, Olga's religious policies had limited immediate impact on state ideology. Even so, her influence would extend far beyond her own generation. The Christian path she opened would eventually be completed by her grandson, Volodymyr the Great. Princess Olga died in 969, having preserved dynastic continuity, strengthened administrative institutions, expanded diplomatic connections, and introduced a religious vision that would permanently change the future of Kyivan Rus. Few rulers inherited a greater crisis. Even fewer transformed that crisis into the foundation of lasting state development. Among all the rulers of early Kyivan Rus, few embodied the image of the warrior prince as completely as Sviatoslav Irovich. In both medieval chronicles and later historical memory, he appears as a commander whose life was defined by constant movement, military campaigns, and personal courage. Unlike his mother, Princess Olga, who focused on administration, diplomacy, and institutional reform, Sviatoslav chose a different path, one shaped by warfare, expansion, and direct confrontation with the most powerful states of his time. Sviatoslav was born sometime during the 940s, the son of Prince Ihor and Princess Olga. When his father was killed in 945, he was still a child, and political authority remained in the hands of his mother for many years. Although Olga governed his region, sources suggest that Sviatoslav was raised within the military traditions of the ruling elite from an early age. The primary chronicle describes him as a ruler of exceptional physical endurance and personal discipline. Unlike many later monarchs who governed from fortified capitals, Sviatoslav is portrayed as a prince who lived much like his warriors. He reportedly slept on the ground, carried minimal possessions, and shared the hardships of campaign life with his retinue. One of the most famous phrases attributed to him in historical tradition was his message to enemy rulers before battle: "I am coming against you." Whether these exact words were ever spoken remains uncertain, but they reflect the reputation he earned among both allies and enemies. By the early 960s, as Sviatoslav reached adulthood, he gradually assumed direct control over the affairs of state. His reign would become one of the most militarily active periods in the history of early Rus. His first major strategic objective lay to the east. For generations, the Khazar Khaganate had dominated large portions of the steppe and controlled important trade routes connecting Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the Islamic world. The Khazars had also influenced political relations among many Slavic tribes. Around the mid-960s, Sviatoslav launched a series of military campaigns against Khazar territories. Historical sources describe rapid and highly mobile operations across vast distances. His forces attacked key fortified centers and disrupted long-established political and commercial networks. One of his greatest victories was the destruction of major Khazar strongholds, including Sarkal and other strategic centers along major river systems. The collapse of Khazar political power fundamentally altered the balance of power across Eastern Europe. For Kyivan Rus, these victories opened access to new trade routes and weakened a long-standing regional rival. At the same time, the destruction of Khazar defensive systems created new strategic challenges, as the open steppe would soon become accessible to other nomadic groups. After his eastern victories, Sviatoslav turned his attention south and west, toward the Balkans and the Byzantine sphere of influence. During the late 960s, he entered the complex political struggles of southeastern Europe. Initially invited as an ally in regional conflicts, Sviatoslav soon pursued his own ambitions in the Danube region. His campaigns against the First Bulgarian Empire were highly successful. Several major fortified centers fell under his control, and for a time he established military dominance over large parts of the lower Danube. According to the primary chronicle, Sviatoslav became so impressed by the economic and strategic value of the Danube region that he considered relocating his political center there. He reportedly described the area as a place where the wealth of many lands converged. This ambition inevitably brought him into conflict with Byzantium. At first, both sides attempted diplomacy, but growing military tensions soon made armed conflict unavoidable. Byzantine sources, including the writings of Leo the Deacon, provide detailed descriptions of the campaigns that followed. In 970 and 971, Sviatoslav's forces engaged in a series of brutal battles against the armies of Emperor John I Tsimisks. One of the most important confrontations took place near Dorostalon, where Sviatoslav and his warriors endured a prolonged siege. Despite fierce resistance and significant battlefield skill, Sviatoslav eventually agreed to negotiate. A peace agreement allowed him and his surviving forces to withdraw from the Balkans. In 972, while returning toward Kyiv through the lower Dnipro region, Sviatoslav's forces were ambushed by the Pecheneg, a powerful nomadic confederation of the Eurasian steppe. According to both East Slavic and Byzantine traditions, the ambush took place near the Dnipro rapids. Sviatoslav was killed in battle, bringing an end to one of the most aggressive and expansionist reigns in early Rus history. His death created a political vacuum that would soon trigger dynastic conflict among his sons. Yet Sviatoslav's military legacy was immense. He shattered the power of the Khazars, expanded the geopolitical reach of Kyiv, challenged Byzantium on nearly equal terms, and transformed Kyivan Rus into a major military force recognized across Europe and Eurasia. Though he never embraced Christianity and rarely focused on internal reform, Sviatoslav remains one of the most formidable warrior rulers in the history of medieval Eastern Europe. The death of Sviatoslav in 972 marked the end of one of the most aggressive and expansionist reigns in the history of early Kyivan Rus. Yet his military achievements, impressive as they were, left behind an unresolved political problem. Like many rulers of the early medieval world, Sviatoslav had expanded his state through personal authority, military reputation, and direct leadership. But he had not created a stable system of succession capable of guaranteeing unity after his death. As a result, the future of Kyivan Rus passed into the hands of his three sons, Yaroslav, Oleg, and Volodymyr. Each was assigned authority over different territories during their father's lifetime, following a practice common among early dynastic states. Yaroslav, the eldest, received Kyiv and the political center of the realm. Oleg governed the lands of the Derevlians to the west. Volodymyr, the youngest, held authority in the northern territories. At first, the arrangement appears to have maintained a fragile balance. However, beneath the surface, tensions were already growing. Each prince commanded his own warriors, managed his own regional alliances, and possessed ambitions shaped by the political culture of the age. As the eldest son and ruler of Kyiv, Yaroslav held the strongest claim to supreme authority. Historical sources describe him as energetic, politically ambitious, and determined to preserve central control over the lands inherited from his father. Yet ruling Kyiv meant more than occupying the capital. It required balancing powerful military elites, regional loyalties, economic interests, and family rivalries. In the absence of clear succession laws, dynastic conflict was almost inevitable. The first major crisis emerged around 976. According to the primary chronicle, tensions escalated after a hunting dispute involving retainers connected to Yaroslav and Oleg. What may have begun as a local conflict quickly developed into open political confrontation. Whether the specific details recorded by the chronicle are entirely accurate remains uncertain, but the broader political reality is clear. rivalry between the brothers had reached a breaking point. Yaroslav mobilized his forces and launched a campaign against Oleg's territory. During the fighting, Oleg's army was defeated, and he was killed while attempting to retreat through the defenses of one of his fortified positions. The death of Oleg transformed a political rivalry into a dynastic war. When news of his brother's death reached Volodymyr, he recognized the danger immediately. Rather than risk immediate confrontation, he left his territory and sought support among Scandinavian warrior groups across the Baltic region. This temporary exile would prove decisive. Meanwhile, Yaroslav remained in control of Kyiv and appears to have strengthened his authority over much of the existing realm. Some foreign sources suggest that he may have explored closer diplomatic relations with Christian Europe. Although evidence remains limited, several historians have suggested that Yaroslav may have considered diplomatic or even religious connections with the Latin Christian world. If true, this would make his reign an important but often overlooked moment in the international development of Kyivan politics. Yet while Yaroslav governed from Kyiv, Volodymyr was preparing his return. Around 978, Volodymyr came back with a substantial military force composed of loyal supporters and experienced mercenaries. His objective was clear: to challenge his brother and claim control over the dynastic center. Before moving directly against Kyiv, Volodymyr secured strategic territories and built alliances that weakened Yaroslav's political position. Several local leaders appear to have shifted their loyalty as the balance of power began to change. Eventually, Yaroslav found himself increasingly isolated. According to the primary chronicle, negotiations were proposed, and Yaroslav was persuaded to enter what he believed would be a secure political meeting. Instead, he walked into a carefully planned trap. Inside a fortified location near Kyiv, Yaroslav was attacked and killed by men loyal to Volodymyr. The exact circumstances remain debated, and medieval chroniclers often emphasize dramatic detail. However, there is little doubt that Yaroslav died as the result of political assassination. His death brought the first major dynastic civil war in the history of Kyivan Rus to an end. It also revealed a harsh political reality: in the absence of fixed succession laws, military strength, strategic alliances, and personal ambition would often determine who ruled Kyiv. Yaroslav's reign lasted only a few years, but its consequences would shape the future of the dynasty for generations. His death cleared the path for one of the most transformative rulers in the history of Kyivan Rus, his younger brother, Volodymyr. Few rulers in the history of Kyivan Rus transformed the destiny of their state as profoundly as Volodymyr Sviatoslavic, later remembered as Volodymyr the Great. His reign marked a decisive turning point in the political, religious, and cultural development of Eastern Europe. Under his leadership, Kyivan Rus not only expanded its territorial influence and strengthened its internal institutions, but also underwent one of the most significant spiritual transformations in medieval history: the official adoption of Christianity. Volodymyr was born sometime in the mid-10th century, the youngest known son of Sviatoslav Yaroslav. His early years unfolded in a political environment defined by military campaigns, dynastic competition, and expanding international contacts. As a young prince, he he governed northern territories assigned to him during his father's lifetime, gaining early experience in regional leadership and military command. The violent struggle for power following Svyatoslav's death forced Volodymyr into temporary exile. After the death of his brother Oleg and the growing dominance of Yaroslav in Kiev, Volodymyr crossed the Baltic and sought support among Scandinavian warrior groups. This decision would ultimately shape the future of the dynasty. Around 978, Volodymyr returned with an experienced military force composed of loyal followers and foreign mercenaries. Through a combination of military campaigns, political alliances, and strategic planning, he gradually secured control over key territories. His final confrontation with Yaroslav ended with the death of his elder brother and Volodymyr's capture of Kiev. By the end of the 10th century, he had become the sole ruler of a rapidly expanding political entity centered on the Dnipro. The early years of his reign focused on consolidating authority across diverse tribal territories. Different regions of the state possessed their own elites, traditions, and political interests. Maintaining unity required military presence, tribute collection, diplomatic negotiation, and symbolic legitimacy. At first, Volodymyr appears to have relied heavily on traditional religious structures to strengthen his authority. According to the primary chronicle, he supported the worship of major pagan deities and attempted to create a more unified religious system centered around princely power. Archaeological discoveries in Kiev support the existence of ritual sites and elite religious complexes dating to this period. These findings suggest that Volodymyr initially viewed religious centralization as an important political tool. Yet as Kyivan Rus grew in size, economic importance, and diplomatic reach, the limitations of a fragmented pagan system became increasingly clear. By the late 10th century, the rulers of neighboring states, including Byzantium, the kingdoms of Central Europe, and the Christian world of the Balkans, were operating within organized religious and diplomatic frameworks. For Volodymyr, religion had become not only a spiritual question, but also a matter of international strategy. The primary chronicle preserves one of the most famous narratives in East European history, Volodymyr's search for the true faith. According to the chronicle, envoys representing different religious traditions visited his court, presenting the beliefs of Islam, Judaism, Western Christianity, and Byzantine Christianity. Although the literary structure of this story reflects medieval narrative tradition, it also points to a genuine historical reality. Kyivan Rus stood at the crossroads of multiple civilizations. In the late 980s, Volodymyr made the decision that would define his legacy. Around the year 988, following complex diplomatic negotiations with the Byzantine Empire, Volodymyr accepted Christianity in its Byzantine form. The political circumstances were closely tied to events within Byzantium itself. The empire faced internal military challenges, and Volodymyr appears to have provided military support in exchange for a dynastic marriage with Princess Anna, sister of Emperor Basil II. Such a marriage was extraordinarily rare for a foreign ruler and reflected the growing international importance of Kiev. Following his baptism, Volodymyr ordered the large-scale Christianization of his lands. According to historical tradition, religious idols in Kiev were removed, and the population was called to participate in a mass baptism in the waters of the Dnipro. While the exact details of the event remain difficult to reconstruct, archaeological evidence confirms rapid church construction, the appearance of Christian symbols, imported liturgical objects, and the spread of Byzantine artistic influences during this period. The adoption of Christianity transformed every aspect of life in Kyivan Rus. It strengthened diplomatic ties with Byzantium and other Christian states. It introduced written religious literature, ecclesiastical institutions, educational centers, architectural innovation, and new legal and moral frameworks. Volodymyr also initiated broader administrative reforms. He strengthened regional governance, placed trusted family members in strategic territories, improved military organization, and supported urban development. One of the most significant architectural projects associated with his reign was the Church of the Tithes in Kyiv, one of the earliest monumental stone churches in the region. Volodymyr's reign lasted until 1015. By the time of his death, Kyivan Rus had become one of the largest and most influential political entities in medieval Europe, militarily respected, economically connected, diplomatically recognized, and spiritually transformed. Few rulers changed not only the course of their state, but the civilizational direction of an entire region. Volodymyr was one of them. The death of Volodymyr the Great in 1015 marked the end of one of the most transformative reigns in the history of Kyivan Rus. Yet the political and spiritual achievements of his rule did not guarantee a peaceful transition of power. Like many medieval dynasties built through personal authority rather than fixed succession law, the Rurik state once again faced the dangerous question that had haunted earlier generations: who would rule Kiev after the death of the reigning prince? The answer would come through one of the bloodiest dynastic struggles in the history of early Rus. At the center of this conflict stood Svyatopolk, a prince whose name would be remembered in historical tradition as Svyatopolk the Accursed. Whether this title reflects historical reality, political propaganda, or a combination of both remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that his short reign became inseparably associated with civil war, dynastic murder, and the struggle for legitimacy. The origins of Svyatopolk himself remain complex. Historical sources disagree on the exact circumstances of his birth and dynastic position. Some traditions present him as a son of Yaropolk who was later adopted into Volodymyr's household after the death of his father. Other interpretations describe him as one of Volodymyr's biological sons. Regardless of his exact parentage, he grew up within the ruling dynasty and possessed a legitimate claim to political power. Before Volodymyr's death, Svyatopolk had already demonstrated political ambition. He had governed important western territories and established dynastic connections through marriage with influential ruling houses of Central Europe. At one point during Volodymyr's reign, Svyatopolk appears to have fallen under suspicion of political conspiracy. Some written sources suggest that he may have attempted to strengthen his independence through foreign alliances, leading to temporary imprisonment. Whether these accusations were fully justified remains unclear. But they reveal that tensions within the ruling family had been building long before Volodymyr's death. When Volodymyr died in 1015, Svyatopolk moved quickly. Recognizing that control of Kyiv meant control of the dynasty, he secured the capital and declared himself ruler. Yet several of Volodymyr's sons remained alive, each possessing their own territorial bases, military followers, and political ambitions. Among them were Boris, Klyb, and Yaroslav. According to the primary chronicle, Svyatopolk's first objective was the elimination of his most dangerous rivals. The chronicle describes how Boris, one of Volodymyr's most respected sons, was returning from military duty when he learned of his father's death. Despite warnings from his followers, he reportedly refused to begin civil war against his brother. Soon afterward, armed men loyal to Svyatopolk allegedly attacked Boris and killed him. Not long after, Klyb was reportedly summoned under false pretenses and murdered before he could organize resistance. Another brother, Svyatoslav, also appears to have died during the wider conflict. These killings would permanently shape the religious and political memory of Kyivan Rus. Boris and Klyb were later recognized as some of the earliest saints of the Kyivan Christian tradition, honored not as military martyrs, but as rulers who chose not to shed the blood of their own family. Whether Svyatopolk personally ordered every assassination remains debated among modern historians. Medieval chronicles were often written under the influence of later political victors, and accusations against defeated rivals sometimes served dynastic narratives. However, regardless of the exact details, the political result was clear: open civil war had begun. The greatest challenge to Svyatopolk's authority came from Yaroslav, Prince of Northern Territories and one of the most capable members of the dynasty. Unlike Boris and Klyb, Yaroslav chose military resistance. Drawing support from local elites, professional warriors, and Scandinavian allies, he began preparing for a campaign against Kyiv. The first major clashes between the two brothers took place in 1016. Historical sources describe large armies confronting one another along major river routes and strategic crossings. After intense fighting, Yaroslav emerged victorious and entered Kyiv. Svyatopolk fled westward, seeking support from his father-in-law, the powerful ruler of Poland, King Bolesław the Brave. With foreign military assistance, Svyatopolk managed to return and temporarily reclaim Kyiv. But the struggle was far from over. Over the next several years, both sides continued gathering allies, rebuilding armies, and fighting for control of the dynastic center. The decisive confrontation came in 1019 near the Alta River. There, Yaroslav's forces defeated Svyatopolk in what would become one of the defining battles of early Kyivan history. After his defeat, Svyatopolk fled once again. Historical records of his final days are uncertain. Some suggest he died while fleeing through frontier territories. Others imply that illness, exhaustion, or abandonment ended his life soon afterward. What remains certain is that his fall ended one of the darkest succession crises in the history of the dynasty. His defeat also opened the path for the rise of one of the greatest rulers in the history of Kyivan Rus, Yaroslav the Wise. Few rulers in the history of Kyivan Rus left a legacy as profound and enduring as Yaroslav the Wise. Under his leadership, the state centered in Kyiv reached one of the highest points of its political power, cultural influence, legal development, and international prestige. Historians often describe his reign as the Golden Age of Kyivan Rus, a period when military strength, dynastic diplomacy, Christian culture, and urban development came together in a way that would shape Eastern Europe for centuries. Yaroslav's path to power had been forged through years of civil war. After defeating his brother Svyatopolk near the Alta River in 1019, he secured control over Kyiv and gradually established himself as the undisputed leader of the Rurik dynasty. Yet the wounds left by dynastic conflict were deep, and his first challenge was not expansion, but stabilization. When Yaroslav entered Kyiv, he inherited a state that was territorially vast but politically fragile. Regional princes, tribal elites, military commanders, and urban communities all possessed their own interests. Maintaining unity required more than military authority. It required institutions, law, diplomacy, and a vision of statehood that could outlive a single ruler. One of Yaroslav's first priorities was the strengthening of dynastic legitimacy. He actively promoted the memory of his father, Volodymyr the Great, as the Christian founder of the state, while also encouraging the religious veneration of his brothers Boris and Hlib, whose deaths during the civil war had already become symbols of Christian sacrifice. By reinforcing these dynastic and spiritual narratives, Yaroslav transformed political memory into a tool of state consolidation. At the same time, he expanded the military security of the realm. Throughout the early years of his reign, Kyivan Rus continued to face pressure from nomadic groups moving across the southern steppe. Among the most persistent were the Pecheneg, whose raids had threatened trade routes, agricultural settlements, and frontier communities for generations. In 1036, Yaroslav achieved one of the greatest military victories of his reign when his forces decisively defeated a major Pecheneg army near Kyiv. This victory not only secured the capital, but also significantly reduced the long-term threat posed by Pecheneg incursions. To commemorate this triumph, Yaroslav launched one of the most ambitious building programs in the history of medieval Eastern Europe. At the center of this program stood St. Sophia Cathedral. Inspired by the great churches of Constantinople yet shaped by local architectural traditions, St. Sophia became far more than a religious structure. It served as a symbol of dynastic legitimacy, Christian identity, political authority, and cultural confidence. Even today, the cathedral remains one of the most important surviving monuments of medieval Kyiv. Yaroslav's architectural vision extended beyond a single building. During his reign, the fortifications of Kyiv were expanded, new defensive walls were constructed, urban districts grew, monasteries appeared, and ecclesiastical centers became increasingly integrated into state administration. One of the most famous elements of this urban expansion was the construction of the Golden Gate of Kyiv, a monumental fortified entrance that symbolized both military strength and political prestige. Yet Yaroslav's legacy was not built on stone alone. He is widely associated with the earliest written legal tradition of Kyivan Rus. Under his rule emerged the foundations of what later became known as Ruskaya Pravda, one of the earliest legal compilations in Eastern Europe. Although the text continued to evolve after his death, its earliest layers are closely connected to his reign. The legal principles associated with this code reveal an increasingly sophisticated society. Instead of relying exclusively on blood revenge and personal retaliation, the law introduced structured compensation, property protection, inheritance regulation, and judicial procedure. This shift marked an important step in the development of institutional governance. Education and literacy also flourished under Yaroslav's leadership. Historical sources describe the copying of manuscripts, the translation of religious texts, the creation of libraries, and the expansion of clerical education. One tradition even associates Yaroslav with one of the earliest princely libraries in Kyiv. Whether every detail of these accounts can be verified remains debated, but archaeological and manuscript evidence confirms an extraordinary growth of literary culture during this period. Yaroslav also understood the power of dynastic diplomacy. Rather than relying only on military alliances, he used marriage as a strategic instrument of international influence. His daughters married into some of the most powerful royal families of Europe. One became Queen of France, another entered the royal house of Norway, and another established ties with the Kingdom of Hungary. Because of these connections, later historians sometimes described Yaroslav as the father-in-law of Europe. These alliances placed Kyiv at the center of an international political network stretching from Scandinavia to Western Europe and from the Baltic to Byzantium. By the final years of his reign, Kyivan Rus had become one of the most respected political entities of medieval Europe. Its capital was fortified and monumental. Its churches reflected both spiritual ambition and artistic achievement. Its laws were becoming more sophisticated. Its ruling dynasty was connected to royal courts across the continent. When Yaroslav died in 1054, he left behind not only a powerful state, but a political and cultural model that would influence generations of rulers. Yet even at the height of this golden age, a familiar problem remained unresolved: the question of succession. And once again, the future of Kyivan Rus would depend on the ability of brothers to share power without destroying the state their father had built. When Yaroslav the Wise died in 1054, he left behind one of the strongest states in medieval Europe. Kyivan Rus possessed fortified cities, established diplomatic networks, growing literary culture, legal traditions, and dynastic prestige recognized across the continent. Yet even Yaroslav, for all his political wisdom, could not fully solve the greatest structural challenge of the Rurik dynasty, the peaceful transfer of power. Rather than naming a single unquestioned successor, Yaroslav attempted a more complex solution. Before his death, he divided major territories among his sons while preserving Kyiv as the senior political center. The eldest son, Yaroslav, received Kyiv in the formal position of senior prince. Sviatoslav governed powerful eastern lands, while Vsevolod controlled strategically important southern and northeastern territories. In theory, this arrangement was designed to preserve both dynastic unity and regional stability. In practice, it created a delicate political balance that required constant negotiation, mutual trust, and military cooperation. For nearly 2 decades after Yaroslav's death, his 3 sons, Yaroslav Yaroslavic, Sviatoslav Yaroslavic, and Vsevolod Yaroslavic, governed what modern historians often describe as a political triumvirate. This period did not represent complete harmony. Disagreements existed, rival interests emerged, and regional elites often pursued their own ambitions. Yet compared with earlier periods of open dynastic warfare, the brothers managed to preserve a remarkable degree of cooperation. One reason for this temporary unity was the growing external pressure facing Kyivan Rus. By the middle of the 11th century, the geopolitical landscape of the Eurasian steppe was changing rapidly. The decline of earlier nomadic powers created opportunities for new groups to move westward. Among the most dangerous were the Cumans, also known in many historical sources as the Kipchaks. These highly mobile steppe warriors would become one of the most persistent military challenges faced by the rulers of Rus over the next 2 centuries. The first major confrontations occurred during the reign of Yaroslav's sons. In 1061, steppe raiders launched attacks against frontier territories, exposing weaknesses in regional defense. Although the brothers responded with military campaigns, the challenge would soon intensify. The most dramatic early confrontation came in 1068. That year, the combined forces of the 3 brothers confronted a major Cuman army near the Alta River, the same region where earlier dynastic battles had once shaped the future of the state. This time, however, the outcome was very different. The army of Kyivan Rus suffered a significant defeat. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. For the first time in generations, the population of Kyiv openly questioned the effectiveness of princely leadership. According to the primary chronicle, citizens gathered in public assembly and demanded weapons in order to organize the defense of the city. When their demands were rejected, political unrest followed. This episode is one of the earliest clear examples of urban political participation recorded in the history of Kyivan Rus. The Assembly of Kyiv demonstrated that the capital was no longer merely a residence of princes. It had become a political community with its own expectations, interests, and growing sense of collective responsibility. The military defeat also weakened the authority of the senior prince, Yaroslav. Soon afterward, political unrest forced him to leave Kyiv temporarily. In his absence, rival dynastic claims quickly emerged. Although Yaroslav eventually returned with foreign military support, the events of 1068 permanently altered the balance between dynastic authority and urban political life. Despite these challenges, the brothers continued to cooperate in several important areas. One of their most significant achievements was the continued development of the legal traditions first strengthened under Yaroslav. During their reign, new legal provisions were added to Ruskaya Pravda, expanding protections related to property, inheritance, judicial procedure, and social order. These additions reflected a society becoming increasingly complex, urbanized, and economically interconnected. The brothers also continued diplomatic engagement with neighboring powers, including Byzantine Empire, Central European kingdoms, and steppe confederations. Marriage alliances, military treaties, and negotiated settlements remained essential tools of statecraft. Yet beneath the surface of cooperation, deeper structural tensions remained unresolved. Each brother commanded his own military retinue. Each regional court developed its own alliances. Each princely branch possessed legitimate dynastic ambitions. By the early 1070s, the balance began to collapse. Personal rivalries, competing claims, foreign intervention, and changing military fortunes gradually turned cooperation into confrontation. The political experiment created by Yaroslav had preserved unity for a generation. But it had not eliminated the fundamental problem of divided sovereignty. And as the brothers aged, the struggle for Kyiv would begin once again. By the late 11th century, Kyivan Rus had entered a period of growing political fragmentation. The generation of Yaroslav the Wise had passed, and the delicate balance once maintained by his sons was steadily breaking apart. Regional princes competed for influence, dynastic branches strengthened their local power bases, and the senior throne of Kyiv no longer guaranteed unquestioned authority across the entire realm. At the same time, external threats continued to grow. Steppe confederations launched frequent raids against agricultural settlements, trade routes, and frontier towns. Regional conflicts drained military resources, weakened political trust, and exposed the structural limits of a state built on dynastic compromise. It was in this increasingly unstable world that one of the most respected rulers in the history of Kyivan Rus emerged, Volodymyr Monomakh. Born in 1053, Volodymyr belonged to one of the most distinguished branches of the ruling dynasty. He was the son of Vsevolod Yaroslavic and the grandson of Yaroslav the Wise. Through his mother, he was connected to the imperial traditions of the Byzantine Empire, a connection that later inspired the dynastic name Monomakh, associated with the imperial house of Constantine Monomachos. From an early age, Volodymyr was deeply involved in military and political life. Unlike princes who inherited stability, he matured in an era defined by constant warfare, fragile alliances, and shifting loyalties. Historical sources describe him participating in military campaigns while still young, learning the realities of frontier politics, diplomacy, and dynastic negotiation. By the late 11th century, Volodymyr had already built a reputation as one of the most capable commanders among the princes of Rus. Yet his greatest strength was not military skill alone. He understood that endless rivalry among members of the dynasty posed as much danger as any external enemy. One of the defining moments of his early political career came in 1097. That year, leading princes of Rus gathered at the Congress of Lubeck, one of the most important political assemblies in the history of the medieval state. The purpose of the gathering was clear: to reduce internal conflict and create a more stable framework for dynastic coexistence. The famous principle associated with the Congress declared that each prince should hold his hereditary lands, reducing the constant competition for redistribution of territories. Although the agreement did not eliminate conflict entirely, it represented an important attempt to preserve political order in an increasingly fragmented realm. Volodymyr played a central role in these negotiations. He recognized that survival required cooperation. At the same time, he continued to lead military campaigns against the Cumans, who remained the most dangerous external threat to the southern frontier. Over several decades, Volodymyr participated in numerous campaigns across the steppe. Historical sources describe coordinated operations involving multiple princely armies, deep raids into enemy territory, and carefully planned seasonal offensives. Among his greatest successes were the campaigns of the early 12th century, particularly those around 1103, 1107, and 1111. These victories significantly weakened Cuman military pressure and temporarily secured major trade corridors and agricultural regions. His military leadership restored confidence among regional elites and strengthened his reputation across the lands of Rus. Yet despite his prestige, Volodymyr did not immediately seek the throne of Kyiv. For many years he respected the seniority traditions of the dynasty, even when political circumstances might have justified a direct claim. This restraint enhanced his legitimacy. By 1113, however, circumstances in Kyiv changed dramatically. When Prince Svyatopolk II died, social unrest erupted in the capital. Economic tensions, debt disputes, and growing dissatisfaction among urban communities created a serious political crisis. The people and leading elites of Kyiv turned to Volodymyr as the one ruler capable of restoring stability. He accepted the invitation and entered Kyiv as Grand Prince. His accession marked the beginning of one of the last great periods of political recovery in the history of Kyivan Rus. Once in power, Volodymyr moved quickly. He introduced legal reforms designed to reduce social tensions, regulate debt obligations, and limit abuses by powerful creditors. These reforms became incorporated into later versions of Russkaya Pravda. He also strengthened communication between regional courts, reinforced military organization, and promoted dynastic cooperation wherever possible. Equally important was his intellectual legacy. Volodymyr is traditionally associated with one of the most remarkable literary works of medieval Eastern Europe, the Instruction of Volodymyr Monomakh. In this text, he addressed his sons and future rulers, emphasizing justice, discipline, personal responsibility, military readiness, religious devotion, and compassion toward ordinary people. Few medieval rulers left behind such a direct expression of political philosophy. Volodymyr's reign in Kyiv lasted until 1125. By the time of his death, he had restored prestige to the capital, weakened external threats, reduced internal instability, and temporarily reunited much of the political world created by his ancestors. Many historians regard him as the last ruler who successfully governed Kyivan Rus as a truly unified political civilization. After his death, the forces of regional fragmentation would return with renewed strength. But for one final generation, under Volodymyr Monomakh, the old power of Kyiv still endured. When Volodymyr Monomakh died in 1125, he left behind a state that had temporarily regained much of its former strength. Military victories against steppe raiders had restored security along major trade routes. Legal reforms had strengthened public confidence in central authority. Regional princes, though still ambitious, had been brought into a workable political balance. The responsibility for preserving this fragile unity now passed to his eldest son, Mstislav the Great. Born in 1076, Mstislav had spent much of his life preparing for leadership. Unlike many princes whose authority was limited to a single regional court, he gained political and military experience across multiple territories of Rus. Throughout his early career, he governed important frontier lands, commanded military campaigns, negotiated with foreign rulers, and developed relationships with both dynastic allies and urban elites. By the time he inherited the throne of Kyiv, he was already one of the most experienced members of the dynasty. Historical sources often describe Mstislav as a ruler who combined the military energy of his grandfather with the political discipline of his father. This combination would prove essential. Although Volodymyr Monomakh had restored stability, the structural pressures threatening unity had not disappeared. Regional branches of the dynasty continued to strengthen their own local power. Economic interests increasingly centered around regional trade hubs. Urban communities were becoming more politically active, and the old succession system remained unresolved. Mstislav understood that preserving unity required constant movement, negotiation, and visible leadership. Unlike rulers who governed mainly from the capital, he remained actively engaged across the wider territories of the realm. He traveled frequently, met with regional princes, inspected frontier defenses, organized military campaigns, and intervened directly in local disputes. This personal presence helped maintain political cohesion. One of Mstislav's major priorities was the defense of southern and eastern frontiers. The Cumans remained an unpredictable military threat, capable of launching sudden raids across open steppe corridors. Like his father, Mstislav believed that defense alone was insufficient. Instead, he organized offensive campaigns deep into steppe territory, forcing enemy confederations onto the defensive and protecting key agricultural regions. These operations helped preserve the economic stability of the southern lands and protected vital trade routes connected to the Dnipro basin. At the same time, Mstislav paid close attention to the western frontier. Relations with Central European rulers, Baltic communities, and neighboring dynasties required careful diplomacy. Marriage alliances continued to serve as instruments of political strategy, connecting the ruling house of Kyiv to courts across northern and central Europe. Several members of his family established dynastic connections with Scandinavian and Central European ruling houses, reinforcing the international prestige inherited from earlier generations. Mstislav also remained committed to the development of Christian institutions. During his reign, monasteries continued to grow in influence, manuscript production expanded, and ecclesiastical centers played an increasingly important role in education, diplomacy, and administration. The cultural legacy created under Yaroslav the Wise and strengthened under Monomakh remained alive. Architectural development continued in Kyiv and other major centers. Stone churches, fortified compounds, and urban infrastructure reflected both economic confidence and political ambition. Yet beneath these signs of stability, deeper changes were underway. Regional principalities such as Chernihiv, Halych, Smolensk, and other powerful centers were becoming increasingly self-sufficient. Local elites no longer depended entirely on Kyiv for legitimacy or military protection. Economic networks were diversifying. Political identities were becoming more regional. Mstislav managed to hold these forces together largely through personal authority. This was both his greatest strength and the greatest weakness of the system. As long as a ruler of exceptional skill occupied the throne, unity remained possible. But the institutions needed to preserve that unity beyond a single generation remained incomplete. By the early 1130s, signs of growing dynastic tension were becoming increasingly visible. Disputes over succession, territory, and seniority began to reappear among younger members of the ruling house. Mstislav continued to mediate these conflicts, but even his authority had limits. When Mstislav the Great died in 1132, many chroniclers and modern historians alike viewed his death as the symbolic end of a unified Kyivan political order. Kyiv remained an important spiritual, cultural, and dynastic center. But from this point forward, the balance of power would increasingly shift toward regional principalities. The age of unified leadership had not ended overnight. But after Mstislav, it would never fully return. By the middle of the 12th century, the political landscape of the lands once united under the rulers of Kyivan Rus had changed dramatically. The age of strong centralized authority, represented by rulers such as Yaroslav the Wise and Volodymyr Monomakh, was fading into memory. Regional dynastic branches had grown stronger, economic centers were becoming increasingly independent, and the struggle for Kyiv had evolved into a contest not only for power, but for historical legitimacy. Among the most ambitious princes of this new era was Yuri Dolgoruki. His name would become associated with political persistence, territorial expansion, and a fundamental shift in the geographic focus of dynastic power. Yuri was born around the final decades of the 11th century as one of the younger sons of Volodymyr Monomakh. Unlike many earlier rulers whose political careers were centered around the Dnipro basin, Yuri spent much of his life in the northeastern territories of the dynasty. These lands were very different from the traditional heartland of Kyiv. Dense forests, river networks, expanding agricultural settlements, and growing frontier towns shaped the political world in which Yuri developed as a ruler. The northeastern lands offered opportunities unavailable in the older southern centers. Population growth, internal colonization, new trade routes, and relative distance from steppe raids created conditions for long-term expansion. Yuri understood this better than most of his contemporaries. Rather than focusing exclusively on inherited prestige, he invested in the construction of fortified settlements, the development of regional administration, and the consolidation of local elite support. This strategy gradually transformed his northeastern domains into one of the most dynamic political regions of the wider Rus world. Historical sources describe Yuri as energetic, determined, and often relentless in pursuing his goals. His later nickname, Dolgoruki, often translated as long-armed, reflected not physical appearance, but political reach. His influence extended far beyond his immediate territories. He built alliances across multiple dynastic branches, negotiated with neighboring rulers, and intervened repeatedly in disputes far from his regional base. Yet no prize carried greater symbolic importance than Kyiv. To occupy Kyiv still meant claiming seniority within the House of Rurik. No matter how wealthy or secure a regional principality became, the throne of Kyiv remained the highest symbol of dynastic legitimacy. Yuri understood this perfectly. Throughout the 1140s and 1150s, he became one of the most active participants in the increasingly complex succession struggles surrounding the capital. Using military alliances, family connections, negotiated settlements, and direct campaigns, he repeatedly challenged rival princes for control of Kyiv. His political career became defined by persistence. He would gain influence, lose it, rebuild support, and return again. Unlike rulers of earlier generations, Yuri did not rely solely on the loyalty of southern elites. He brought with him supporters from the northeast, warriors, administrators, and dynastic allies whose political identity was increasingly shaped outside the traditional Kyivan core. This was historically significant. For the first time, the political center of gravity within the dynasty was beginning to shift. In 1149, Yuri successfully entered Kyiv and claimed the title of Grand Prince. His victory represented more than a personal achievement. It demonstrated that power rooted in distant regional centers could now challenge, and temporarily control, the old capital. Yet holding Kyiv proved more difficult than capturing it. Local alliances remained unstable. Urban elites possessed their own interests. Rival dynastic branches continued to mobilize opposition. Over the following years, Yuri would gain and lose the city multiple times. Each campaign revealed the changing realities of political life in the 12th century. Kyiv remained prestigious, but no longer guaranteed lasting authority. Meanwhile, Yuri continued strengthening his northeastern domains. Several urban centers associated with his administration grew significantly during this period. One of the most famous later traditions connects Yuri with the early political development of Moscow, first mentioned in written sources in 1147 during his reign. While the settlement itself likely existed earlier, Yuri's political activity helped integrate such frontier centers into wider dynastic networks. This would have consequences far beyond his own lifetime. In 1155, Yuri once again secured control over Kyiv. This time his rule proved more stable. He remained on the throne until his death in 1157. Yet even in his final years, the contradictions of the age remained clear. He ruled Kyiv, but his true political foundation lay elsewhere. His resources, alliances, and long-term vision were increasingly connected to the northeastern lands rather than the old Dnipro heartland. When Yuri Dolgoruki died in 1157, he left behind more than a contested political legacy. He had helped transform the internal geography of the Rurik world. Power was no longer flowing only toward Kyiv. For the first time in centuries, it was beginning to move away from it. And his son would carry that transformation even further. When Yuri Dolgoruki died in 1157, he left behind a political legacy that extended far beyond his own lifetime. He had demonstrated that the northeastern branches of the Rurik dynasty could compete directly for the highest authority within the dynastic world of Rus. Yet his son, Andrei Bogolyubsky, would take this transformation even further. If Yuri had challenged the traditional political order, Andrei would fundamentally redefine it. Born sometime in the early decades of the 12th century, Andrei grew up during a period of increasing regional competition. He belonged to a generation of princes who no longer viewed Kyiv as the unquestioned center of political gravity. While the city still possessed enormous dynastic prestige, practical power was increasingly tied to regional resources, military networks, and emerging urban centers far beyond the Dnipro basin. Andrei spent much of his early political career in the northeastern lands inherited from his father. These territories, centered around Vladimir, Suzdal, and surrounding settlements, were undergoing rapid development. Forest agriculture was expanding. River trade connected local markets to broader commercial networks. Fortified towns were growing in both population and strategic importance. Unlike many earlier princes who spent their lives moving between established dynastic centers, Andrei sought something different. He wanted not simply to inherit power, but to relocate it. Historical sources portray him as ambitious, deeply religious, politically independent, and often uncompromising. He invested heavily in the development of his own regional court, strengthening local fortifications, expanding administrative structures, and supporting monumental church construction. One of the most important centers of his rule became Bogolyubovo, a residence closely associated with his political identity and later with his historical nickname. From this base, Andrei began pursuing a strategy that would permanently reshape the political geography of the Rurikid world. Unlike earlier princes who viewed Kyiv as the ultimate destination of political ambition, Andrei increasingly treated it as a symbol rather than a necessity. He sought legitimacy, but on his own terms. Throughout the 1160s, dynastic struggles across the lands of Rus continued with growing intensity. Rival branches competed for succession, alliances shifted rapidly, and the throne of Kyiv changed hands with increasing frequency. Andrei watched carefully. Rather than moving south to rule personally in Kyiv, he built military coalitions from a distance, using dynastic alliances and regional influence to shape events in the old capital. Then, in 1169, he launched one of the most consequential campaigns in the history of medieval Eastern Europe. Andrei assembled a large coalition of princely forces drawn from multiple regional branches of the dynasty. These forces marched south toward Kyiv. The campaign itself was not unusual by the standards of dynastic politics. Princes had fought for Kyiv many times before. What followed, however, would shock contemporaries and permanently alter the symbolic status of the city. After intense fighting, the coalition captured Kyiv. But instead of preserving the city as the sacred political center of the dynasty, the victors treated it as conquered territory. Chronicles describe widespread looting across urban districts. Churches were entered. Treasures were removed. Religious objects, manuscripts, ceremonial regalia, and dynastic valuables were taken. Residential quarters suffered destruction. Monastic communities faced violence. Although medieval chroniclers often emphasized dramatic details, archaeological evidence confirms significant destruction across parts of the city during this period. For generations, Kyiv had been viewed not merely as a political capital, but as the spiritual heart of the dynastic world created by Volodymyr the Great and strengthened by Yaroslav the Wise. Its churches housed relics. Its monasteries preserved manuscripts. Its walls symbolized the unity of the dynasty. Now, for the first time, members of that same dynasty had treated the city as spoils of war. The psychological impact was enormous. Many historians regard 1169 as one of the great turning points in the history of medieval Rus. Kyiv survived. Its churches continued functioning. Its merchants continued trading. Its dynastic significance did not disappear overnight. But its aura of untouchable political supremacy had been broken. Perhaps even more significant was Andrei's next decision. He did not move to Kyiv. Instead, after the victory, he installed another prince as ruler while remaining in his own northeastern lands. This decision revealed a revolutionary political reality. For the first time in the history of the dynasty, a prince had successfully conquered Kyiv without intending to make it the center of his own rule. Power no longer needed to reside on the Dnipro. It could now exist independently, and perhaps permanently, elsewhere. Andrei continued ruling from the northeast, strengthening his regional institutions, expanding monumental architecture, and cultivating a court whose ambitions extended far beyond traditional dynastic geography. Yet his increasingly centralized style of rule also created enemies. His authority over local elites became more demanding. His independence from older dynastic customs created political tension. In 1174, those tensions reached a violent conclusion. At his residence in Bogolyubovo, Andrei Bogolyubsky was assassinated by members of his own inner circle. His death ended one of the most controversial reigns in the history of the dynasty. Yet his political revolution endured. After Andrei, no ruler of Rus could assume that Kyiv alone defined legitimacy. The old center remained sacred. But the future of power had begun moving elsewhere. By the final decades of the 12th century, the political landscape of the former Kyivan world had changed beyond recognition. The old system of dynastic seniority still existed in theory, but in practice the lands of Rus had become a complex network of competing regional principalities. Kyiv remained spiritually important. Its monasteries preserved centuries of Christian tradition. Its churches still attracted pilgrims. Its dynastic symbolism remained powerful. Yet real political initiative was increasingly emerging elsewhere. Among the most dynamic regions of this new era were the western lands of Volhynia and Galicia. Protected by forests, rivers, and mountain corridors, these territories occupied one of the most strategically valuable positions in Eastern Europe. Trade routes connected them with the Baltic region, Central Europe, the Black Sea world, and the Carpathian passes. Agricultural wealth, urban growth, and access to foreign markets created the foundations for a powerful regional state. It was within this environment that one of the most remarkable rulers of the late Rurikid era emerged, Roman Mstislavic. Born around the middle of the 12th century, Roman belonged to one of the most respected branches of the dynasty. He was a direct descendant of Volodymyr Monomakh and inherited both dynastic legitimacy and political ambition. His father, Mstislav, had ruled important western territories, giving Roman access to one of the most strategically promising regions of the wider Rus world. From an early age, Roman was exposed to a political environment very different from the one that had shaped earlier rulers in Kyiv. The western frontier demanded flexibility. Local boyar elites possessed significant influence. Neighboring powers such as the Kingdom of Poland and the Kingdom of Hungary regularly intervened in regional politics. Trade and diplomacy often mattered as much as military strength. Roman learned quickly. By the late 12th century, he had established himself as ruler of Volhynia, one of the most stable and economically productive principalities in the region. Unlike many princes who spent years engaged in endless succession conflicts, Roman focused on strengthening administration, securing local alliances, and building a disciplined military base. These preparations would soon transform the balance of power. One of the greatest opportunities of Roman's career emerged in Galicia. This wealthy region had long been influenced by powerful aristocratic families whose political ambitions often rivaled those of the princes themselves. Control over Galicia meant access to trade wealth, strategic fortresses, and international influence. But it also required confronting some of the strongest regional elites in Eastern Europe. Roman accepted that challenge. In 1199, following a period of political instability and dynastic vacancy, he successfully united Volhynia and Galicia under his rule. This was one of the most important political consolidations in the history of the post-Kyivan era. For the first time, a major Western state emerged with enough resources, military strength, and dynastic legitimacy to compete with any princely center in the wider Rus world. Modern historians often identify this union as the foundation of the Galicia-Volhynia state. Roman's ambitions did not stop there. Like many members of the Rurik dynasty, he understood the symbolic value of Kyiv. Although the political authority of the old capital had declined, control over Kyiv still carried enormous dynastic importance. During the early years of the 13th century, Roman intervened directly in central dynastic politics. Through military campaigns and shifting alliances, he expanded his influence toward the Dnipro basin and temporarily secured authority over Kyiv. This achievement gave him something few Western princes had previously possessed: both regional power and dynastic seniority. Contemporary sources describe Roman as decisive, disciplined, and often severe. Some chronicles portray him as a ruler capable of harsh action when confronting political opposition. This was particularly visible in his relationship with local aristocratic factions. Roman believed that princely authority should remain stronger than boyar ambition. When necessary, he acted aggressively to limit the independence of powerful noble families. This strengthened central authority but also created long-term political enemies. At the same time, Roman remained active in foreign diplomacy. He negotiated with neighboring rulers, monitored developments in Central Europe, and participated in broader regional power struggles. His position between Western kingdoms, steppe territories, and the lands of Rus gave him unusual strategic flexibility. By the beginning of the 13th century, Roman had become one of the most powerful rulers in Eastern Europe. Some chroniclers even referred to him with titles emphasizing his exceptional authority among the princes of Rus. Yet his reign would be cut unexpectedly short. In 1205, while conducting a military campaign near the lands of Kingdom of Poland, Roman was killed in battle. The circumstances remain debated, but his death created an immediate political vacuum. His heirs were still young. Regional boyars saw new opportunities. Foreign powers prepared to intervene. And the state Roman had built would soon face its greatest test. Yet despite his relatively short reign, Roman Mstislavic had achieved something extraordinary. At a time when the old political center of Kiev was fading, he created a new Western power capable of carrying the political legacy of Rus into a new century. And that legacy would soon be inherited by his son. When Roman Mstislavic died unexpectedly in 1205, the political structure he had built began to shake almost immediately. The Galicia-Volhynia state was still young. Its institutions were developing. Its borders remained vulnerable. And its future now rested in the hands of children. Among them was Roman's son, Danilo Romanovich. Born in 1201, Danilo entered a world defined by dynastic rivalry, foreign intervention, and political uncertainty. He was still a child when his father died, and almost immediately powerful boyar families began competing for control over the western lands. Neighboring rulers from the Kingdom of Hungary and the Kingdom of Poland also recognized an opportunity to expand their influence. For several years, Danilo and his family lived in exile, moving between allied courts, protected territories, and loyal supporters. These early experiences shaped him profoundly. Unlike princes raised in stable courts, Danilo grew up understanding that power was never guaranteed. It had to be reclaimed. It had to be defended. And sometimes, it had to be rebuilt from almost nothing. As he reached adulthood, Danilo began the long process of restoring his father's political inheritance. Step by step, through military campaigns, negotiated alliances, and careful diplomacy, he gradually recovered control over Volhynia. From there, he turned his attention toward Galicia, where local aristocratic factions continued to resist centralized princely authority. The struggle was long and often brutal. Yet Danilo proved to be not only a capable commander, but also a patient strategist. By the 1230s, he had successfully restored control over both major components of his father's state. The Galicia-Volhynia realm once again stood united. But the world around him was changing rapidly. From the eastern steppe came news of an enemy unlike any previous invader. The armies of the Mongol Empire were moving westward. By the late 1230s, city after city across the lands of Rus faced destruction. Fortified settlements that had survived generations of steppe warfare were falling to disciplined armies equipped with siege technology, superior mobility, and centralized command. Danilo understood the scale of the threat. Unlike some rulers who underestimated the danger, he began preparing his lands for prolonged resistance. Fortifications were strengthened. Military resources were reorganized. Strategic settlements were reinforced. Diplomatic channels with Western courts became increasingly important. Yet even preparation could not fully stop the new reality. After the fall of Kiev in 1240, the political world of Old Rus was permanently transformed. Like many regional rulers, Danilo was eventually forced to recognize the military dominance of the Mongols and negotiate with the emerging Golden Horde. Historical sources describe his journey to the Horde as one of the most difficult moments of his political career. He accepted formal submission. He paid tribute. But unlike many rulers who simply adapted to Mongol dominance, Danilo continued searching for alternatives. He looked west. Throughout the 1240s and 1250s, Danilo pursued one of the most ambitious diplomatic strategies of any ruler in post-Kyivan Eastern Europe. He established contacts with the papacy, Central European monarchs, military orders, and regional Christian powers. His goal was clear: to create an international coalition capable of resisting Mongol domination. These efforts eventually led to one of the most remarkable events in medieval East European history. In 1253, with papal support, Danilo Romanovich was formally crowned King of Rus. The coronation likely took place in Drohikin. For the first time in the history of the Rurik dynasty, one of its rulers officially carried a royal title recognized by Western Christendom. This was not merely ceremonial. It represented Danilo's attempt to reposition the political legacy of Rus within the broader diplomatic system of medieval Europe. Yet the crown alone could not solve the military realities of the age. Western allies offered support, but no decisive anti-Mongol coalition emerged. Danilo therefore continued strengthening his own state from within. He invested heavily in urban development. New fortifications were constructed. Trade centers expanded. Administrative systems became more organized. Military infrastructure improved. Among the most important foundations associated with his reign was Lviv, named in honor of his son Lev. The city would later become one of the most influential urban centers in Eastern Europe. Danilo also supported religious institutions, manuscript culture, regional diplomacy, and economic integration with Central Europe. His court became one of the most dynamic political centers in the post-Kyivan world. He successfully balanced steppe diplomacy, Western alliances, local aristocratic interests, and dynastic continuity. Few rulers of his era faced such complex geopolitical realities. Fewer still navigated them as successfully. When Danilo Romanovich died in 1264, he left behind more than a kingdom. He left behind the strongest political successor to the old civilization of Kyivan Rus. While Kiev itself had fallen, the political tradition of Rus had not disappeared. Under Danilo, it had adapted, survived, and found new life in the West. When Danilo Romanovich died in 1264, he left behind one of the strongest and most politically sophisticated states in Eastern Europe. Unlike many regional rulers who had simply adapted to Mongol dominance, Danilo had created a kingdom capable of balancing tribute obligations, military defense, urban development, and diplomatic relations with both Western Europe and the steppe. Yet even the strongest rulers cannot fully control the forces of history. The generations that followed inherited not only Danilo's achievements, but also the enormous geopolitical pressures surrounding his kingdom. To the east stood the Golden Horde. To the west and north, ambitious neighbors watched closely. To the south, trade corridors remained vulnerable. And within the kingdom itself, dynastic succession would once again shape the future. Danilo's sons inherited a state that remained wealthy, fortified, and internationally connected. Among the most influential was Lev Danilovic. Named after the lion, Lev became one of the most active rulers of the next generation. He inherited not only his father's political ambitions, but also his understanding that survival required flexibility. Under Lev's leadership, the kingdom maintained its diplomatic relations with neighboring powers while continuing to navigate the realities of Mongol influence. Lev is traditionally associated with the further development of Lviv, the urban center founded during his father's reign. Under his rule, the city expanded as a commercial and political center, linking Western Rus with Central European trade networks. Merchants from multiple regions passed through its markets. Artisans, clergy, and administrators helped shape its growing urban identity. Lev also remained active militarily. He participated in campaigns, negotiated shifting alliances, and sought to preserve regional influence during a period of constant geopolitical change. Yet the balance of power across Eastern Europe was changing rapidly. During the late 13th and early 14th centuries, new political actors were emerging. Among the most important was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Originally a regional Baltic power, Lithuania expanded with remarkable speed across former Rus territories. Its rulers adopted flexible diplomatic strategies, military mobility, and pragmatic relations with local dynasties. At the same time, the Kingdom of Poland remained deeply interested in the western lands of Rus. Dynastic marriages, military alliances, and territorial negotiations increasingly linked the future of Galicia-Volhynia with broader Central European politics. The rulers who followed Lev, including Uri of Galicia, Andrew of Galicia, and Leo II of Galicia, worked to preserve the independence of the kingdom. They continued diplomatic negotiations. They defended trade corridors. They supported churches, monasteries, and urban institutions. They maintained dynastic traditions stretching back to the age of Kiev. But the political environment was becoming increasingly unforgiving. The old dynastic networks were weakening. Military resources were limited. Neighboring powers were growing stronger. And succession crises became increasingly dangerous. By the early 14th century, the direct male line descending from Roman Mstislavic began to disappear. This created opportunities for foreign intervention. Competing claims emerged. Regional elites sought external support. Neighboring rulers presented dynastic arguments for political involvement. In 1323, the deaths of Andrew and Leo II created one of the most serious succession crises in the history of the kingdom. Although new rulers temporarily emerged, the political foundations of independent dynastic rule had been severely weakened. Over the following decades, both Lithuania and Poland increased their influence across former Rus territories. Some regions accepted Lithuanian protection. Others entered political unions with Polish rulers. Local elites often negotiated their own arrangements in exchange for autonomy, privileges, or military protection. By the middle of the 14th century, the independent political world created by Roman and Danilo had effectively come to an end. Yet the end of dynastic sovereignty did not mean the end of historical continuity. The legal traditions of Rus survived. Its church institutions endured. Its chronicles continued to be copied. Its urban centers remained active. Its aristocratic families adapted to new political realities. And perhaps most importantly, the memory of Kyiv, Volodymyr, Yaroslav, Roman, and Danilo continued to shape political identity for generations. The political era of Kyivan Rus had ended. Its dynasties had fragmented. Its capitals had changed. Its borders had shifted. But its civilization had not disappeared. It had transformed. And through that transformation, the legacy of Rus entered a new chapter, one that would continue to shape the history of Ukraine and Eastern Europe for centuries to come. And so, the story of Kyivan Rus comes to an end. But the story of Ukraine is only beginning. From the ashes of invasions and the fall of Kiev, a new power would rise in the west, the Kingdom of Galicia, Volhynia. A realm of kings, wars, diplomacy, and survival, standing between Europe and the Mongol world. In the next chapter, we will follow the rulers who fought to preserve the legacy of Rus and shape the future of Eastern Europe. Subscribe to the channel, and continue this journey through the forgotten history of Ukraine with us.